Hello, everybody. This is the first of three videos devoted to talking about the Old English epic poem Beowulf. A hero, a monster, the monster's mother, a dragon. Beowulf, the Old English epic poem, has blockbuster scale drama and adventure. It is also true that Beowulf is written in a style that is alien and obscure, not only because the language itself is unfamiliar to everyone aside from a handful of professional medievalists, but also because the sensibility of the writer, the expectations of the intended audience, and the rhetorical situation that the poem was invented to occupy are all rooted in an ancient and vanished culture. Reading the first few lines of the poem in translation is enough to tell you that the Beowulf poet has a way of expressing himself that is distant, formulaic, recitational, formalized, and mostly humorless. On the one hand, the strangeness of the text can feel like an obstacle to being able to understand it clearly. On the other hand, the strangeness is also one of the most absorbing and compelling features of the text. Not only does the magic of reading a text like this provide us with an opportunity to enter into the minds of the vanished culture that created it, but Beowulf also features strangeness as a theme. The manner in which encounters with strangeness are heroic opportunities to learn about ourselves and even to become ourselves. One of the strange things about Beowulf is how it works as a poem. In Middle English, thanks to the French, poets would start writing poems that went da 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 rhyme, da 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 rhyme. But Old English folk had a completely different way of doing it. Their poetry was in lines, just like we expect, but the lines were divided in the middle by a blank space called a caesura, and the first half of the line before the caesura was connected to the other half not by rhyme, but by alliteration. So a word on one side had to start with the same speech sound as a word on the other side. Most translations attempt to translate this feature of the poem into modern English. Old English poets also like to create or borrow compound words called kennings that are poetic and evocative and that can help the poet keep to the alliterative scheme. Famous kennings from Beowulf are terms like whale road or swan's road for sea and word hoard for vocabulary. My favorite ones from the Heaney translation are bone lappings for tendons and cloud murk for, well, I guess the murk underneath a cloud. You will probably be able to spot other kennings as you read. Underline them. Another thing that's strange, for a famous Old English epic, it's strange that none of Beowulf takes place in England. Beowulf is a Geat from Sweden, and the fight with Grendel and Grendel's mother takes place in Denmark. You may remember from another video that England was invaded and settled by tribes of people from Denmark and thereabouts. Beowulf may have been an oral story from Denmark that was carried over to England, along with the immigrants' Proto-Germanic language. Or it may have been a story that was composed by Anglo-Saxons living in England as a kind of nostalgic tribute to their warrior ancestors from the old country. Nobody knows for sure. But by the time it was written down, around 1000 AD, the warrior tribes of raiders and pillagers who had conquered southeastern Great Britain had settled and become farmers, and in many cases Christians. The person or people who eventually wrote down the oral poem of Beowulf around 1000 AD was almost definitely a monk, and part of the drama of the story is the way the writer attempts to reconcile his obvious admiration for the pagan heroes of long ago with his professional commitment to espousing the views of Christian mercy, humility, and pacifism. While the rhetorical situation that gave rise to the Beowulf poem and story was probably an oral performance intended to amuse audiences with tales of long ago, the same way people these days watch Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones. For the Christian monk writing Beowulf down, however, the rhetorical situation probably took on a more polemical purpose to teach readers about Christian theology, and maybe even to encourage them to break away from the warrior ethos celebrated in the story by emphasizing the ultimate futility of Beowulf's heroics. Perhaps the strangest thing of all the strange things about Beowulf is the way it immerses us into a forlorn cosmos racked with violence, tragedy, and ultimate futility. The narrative as a whole is pervaded with a prevailing sense of doom. To live in the world of the poem is to inhabit a tiny circle of civilization against a backdrop of deadly wilderness. The characters live within the vulnerable protection of their family and neighbors, but the tribe over the next hill or across the sea is always poised to invade and pillage and kill and annihilate at any moment. And also, strangely, the Beowulf poet reminds us they live in this small spark of time between a mysterious past and a doomed future. Individuals, acts of heroism, political achievements, the accumulation of wealth, the generation of children, the creation of civilizations are all overshadowed by the inevitability of death and dissolution. In some ways, this is a pagan attitude rooted in the grim, militaristic code of a warrior race. In other ways, it suggests an early Christian attitude that the world is nothing more than a temporary veil of sorrow. The poem begins with a list of kings who have come and gone. Each one was great in their way, but their only ultimate achievement is the grandeur of their funerary services. Then we come down to Hrothgar, who builds Heorot. Heorot is a mead hall, part throne room, part army barracks, part tavern. It's the gathering place where Hrothgar and his men gather to drink fermented honey and tell war stories and listen to epic poems about their ancestors. It's basically an architectural symbol of the Anglo-Saxon values of fraternity, community, strength, and supremacy over nature. The poet tells us that it was meant to be a wonder of the world forever. But uh-oh, here at the very heart of Hrothgar's people's prosperity and felicity, trouble is in store. What? Grendel? Oh, yeah, sure, we'll get to that. But that's not what I'm talking about here. Beowulf will, spoiler alert, defeat Grendel, but Heorot is doomed anyway. Before Grendel comes into the story, just as the poet is getting to the end of a noble stanza dedicated to how wonderful and awesome Heorot is, the poet tells us that its towering halls and wide gables awaited a barbarous burning. That doom abided, but in time it would come, the killer instinct unleashed against in-laws, the bloodlust rampant. We don't hear anything else about how this happy tribe of warrior folk will eventually kill each other and burn down their own mead hall, but we do get the impression that however exciting Beowulf's story might turn out to be, it can't stop the ultimate doom of time, which destroys everything sooner or later. When Grendel does come into the story, he comes in as a kind of afterthought to this vision of ultimate doom, introducing him as the very face of the kind of conflict and strife that is opposed to human community. It harrowed him, we learn, to hear the din of the loud banquet. Monster is one of those French words that the English language absorbed so many of, and its etymological meaning connects it to the word demonstrate. One of the fun things about monsters is that they are living, often slimy and scary, symbols, capable of absorbing and reflecting many different interpretations. The monster always means something, always signifies. The figure of Grendel is responsive to an infinite array of interpretive possibilities. One way to think about Grendel is that he represents the violence of nature, the wilderness that the Anglo-Saxon settlers to England had to beat back and subjugate, maybe including the Celtic inhabitants with whom the Anglo-Saxons were often in conflict. Another way of thinking about Grendel is that he represents original sin and the presence of evil in the world that resulted from Adam and Eve getting kicked out of the Garden of Eden. In the fallen world, shapes of the devil are everywhere in the landscape, and even in our own hearts. Another way of thinking about Grendel is that he is the unconscious, kind of uncanny shadow self of Beowulf. They both are described as having the strength of 30 men. Of course, all of these interpretations and many more can coexist in various ways. One of the things Grendel makes me think about is how, in a warrior clan culture that relies on everyone sharing allegiance to one king, any dissent or antisocial sentiment that arises out of jealousy, anger, vanity, or whatever is a monstrous threat that can bring the whole house down. Secret rancor in the heart poses a deadly threat to the social stability of such clan groups, and it can mean the difference between everyone living happily together and everyone killing each other with swords and axes. The fact that Grendel's attacks target the mead hall itself suggests to me that Grendel's chief symbolic function is to represent the deadly consequences that deviance, solitude, nonconformity, and outsiderness pose to a tribal society. Wolf, on the other hand, is the model of all the qualities that the people of his culture admire. He is the anti-Grendel. Whereas Grendel is a solitary lurker, Beowulf is always surrounded by his troop of loyal men. Whereas Grendel's body is a gruesome animalian perversion of the human form, Beowulf's body is the supreme warrior body of Viking idealization, or in Christian terms, the stalwart warrior saint. Everyone who sees Beowulf is like, that's a stalwart and hardy dude. He channels all the heroic virtues of Viking culture, being boastful and assertive, but also humble and diplomatic in his interactions with Hrothgar and his court. When his announcement that he will defeat Grendel receives pushback from Unferth, a courtier who's described strangely as sitting at Hrothgar's feet, Beowulf handily differentiates himself from the slavish, effeminate troublemaking of Unferth's gossipy snark, an exchange which serves as a kind of foretaste of Beowulf's coming fight with Grendel. Unferth serves as a kind of mini Grendel, or perhaps the Grendel within. Night falls, and Beowulf and his men stay behind to meet Grendel. In a Batman movie, there's usually a scene where we see Batman putting on his armor before his big fight. In Beowulf, Beowulf does something even more dramatic. He takes his armor off. Armor is a major fetish for the Beowulf poet, and Beowulf's insistence that he will fight Grendel unarmed and unarmored is a dramatic renunciation of technology in preference for the raw power of his sheer humanity, a physical rebuke to Grendel's subhuman monstrosity. The fight between Beowulf and Grendel is so faithful to certain tropes of action movies that it makes you wonder whether action movies learn the vocabulary from the Beowulf poet, or whether contemporary audiences are devolving to share the aesthetic tastes of illiterate warrior folk, or whether some narrative elements are just deeply embedded in the structure of human perception in all times and places. Inevitably, an anonymous Geat has to get eaten as a cue to start the fight. The wrestling of the enormous combatants smashes the furniture of the hall. The muscles and sinews flex and strain. Grendel evinces a sniveling cowardice that shows that he has physical strength but lacks courage or character. Beowulf literally disarms Grendel, ripping off his arm, and Grendel slinks off in shame and ignominy to die in the swamp from whence he came. We'll later learn that he was running home to mommy. And Beowulf has done it. He's a hero. And this is a term that, as much as we sling it around casually today, actually means something very significant when the hero is the person who saves you and your loved ones from being slaughtered by marauding aggressors. Beowulf deserves a great prize that will stand for all time as evidence of his monumental achievement. Hrothgar's got just the thing, a golden torque. A torque is a solid metal necklace. The Beowulf poet tells us that it was the most resplendent torque of gold I ever heard tell of anywhere on earth or under heaven. Sounds nice. What could be better than that? Gold, the very symbol of wealth and permanence. Jewels, the very shape of perfection and eternity. What happened to that torque? Beowulf gave it to his brother-in-law, Hygelac. Hygelac wore it into a battle that he started for a foolish reason, and Hygelac died wearing it. He fell beneath his shield in the gem-crusted kingly gear he had worn when he crossed the frothing wave-vat. So the dead king fell into Frankish hands. They took his breastmail, also his neck-torque, and punier warriors plundered the slain when the carnage ended. Weak corpses covered the field. Thus is this thrilling tale of good gloriously vanquishing evil nested in a wider tale of the futility and vanity of all human activity. Grendel loses and Beowulf wins, but the ultimate victor is chaos, ruination, and despair.